my pleasure to introduce Diane Niblack Fox, who is my friend. We were colleagues in Oregon at Portland State University, Department of Linguistics. I was the chair. She was faculty. She wanted to go to Vietnam to teach English, and I said, oh, everybody said, sure, why not? And so she did that. She went to Vietnam. She was able to maintain contact with the university, with Portland State, so she had the professional connection both in Vietnam and in Oregon. She came back after years in back and forth in Vietnam and went on for a PhD at the University of Washington, and then went on to teach in Massachusetts. But we have known each other for 30 years. She is a fine writer, as many of you here will know. She is a fine writer, and the experience, the on-the-ground talking to people experience is something that she is really excellent at. So I have not read the book. I know a little bit about her background while she was there, but this will be very interesting for everybody, I'm sure. Diane Niblack Fox.
Well, I have lots of thank yous to start with. Thank you to Bea for that. Thank you to Michael and to Chaucer's for hosting us all. This is wonderful. I have another thank you to Bea. To put out this book, I feel like it was a sort of cooperative effort putting out this book. And Bea, without Bea's initial seed of, yes, you can go and come back and go and come back, the book wouldn't have happened at all. So Bea really needs thanks for that.
It benefited everybody, obviously.
And there's another thank you that I want to transmit from a family in Vietnam to you all. Thank you all for your attention to this issue. It's been 50 years, more than 50 years, but 50 years next year since the end of the war. There's so many other things to pay attention to. Thank you for that attention. Speaking with this father of 3 sons, 2 of them whose bodies withered as they grew older, and one who had a heart condition from birth. I was there with something called the Committee for the Care and Protection of Children, and we would bring gifts, cans of sweetened condensed milk and a few cakes, and I apologized for having nothing but that to offer. And he said, your attention, and I transfer this now to you, your attention, the attention of the American people, is a precious spiritual gift. So thank you all for your attention. There's so much else to pay attention to these days, and many of the things in this book are linked to those things. War, the devastation, long-term devastation of war in its aftermath for civilians and for military. Environmental disasters. I'm kind of assuming that you all know something about Agent Orange, that it's a chemical, that it's often used as a generic for the 6 different chemicals that were used to defoliate forests in Vietnam. 10% of the land, the total land of the south of Vietnam was defoliated, giving rise to the term ecocide. 50% of some provinces were defoliated. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. In the introduction to the book, or in the questions at the end of the talk, we can talk more about the chemical part. My focus is the stories that I'd like to share with you. So the land was quite clear what happened to it. The people, lots of fighting back and forth, decades really, to figure out what was and what wasn't. It was mixed with trauma, mixed with anger, denial. When the first American veterans went to the VA hospital and said, I think this is because of Agent Orange, they were sent to the psychiatric ward. At this point, 650,000 veterans have been compensated for consequences of Agent Orange, also by the Veterans Administration. So, but it was a long process, and there's a book, not my book, there's another book to recommend to you. It's called From Enemies to Partners. This is written jointly by a Vietnamese and an American and it traces the entwined science and politics that moved us from when I went to visit the embassy in Hanoi and asked what the official position on Agent Orange was. He pounded the desk and he said, "It's a non-starter, it's a non-starter. That was settled long ago, we don't talk about that." Well, now we do. They work together to detoxify the remaining, especially at air bases where the chemicals were stored. The US and Vietnam have been working together for a couple of decades, anyway, a while. And so that's another. All right, so yes, war, environmental, and the reckoning that's going on in so many ways at this time in our country, reckoning on many different levels. This is one more. And it to me is hopeful that finally, we're acknowledging what we've done in the past. Perhaps that means that we're no longer stuck there. Perhaps that means we can open up to a better future. And so this I see as part of that. So yes, this has many links to many other themes, but it's based in Vietnam. It's focused on Vietnam. The stories in the book, you'll find 30 stories from the South, where the defoliants were sprayed. Defoliants, chemicals, depends who's talking. The center and the north, where people like the American veterans came down to the South and were exposed there. But they were there 10 years, not 1 year. So you can imagine the intensity. Now I'd like to turn to the stories. I'll read you one story. I'll read you the first story from the prologue. And before I do that, I'd like you to, where are we? This is not very Vietnamesque in here. At least not the rice fields. So Michael has some pictures to try and please try to imagine yourself into these rice fields. We're walking through the rice fields to get to the village where this family lives. Yeah. So see the rice fields, and then you'll see our little group walking. My friend Lang organized the trip. In fact, she pushed me. I was kind of, is this right to raise these issues for these people? And everyone I spoke to in Vietnam, the doctors and the social workers said, people are going to want to talk more than you have time to listen. And they were right. And I came to feel like my hesitation, who was that protecting? It wasn't protecting the people who were living with this. They knew what they were living with. Did I just not want to know? Did I not want to face what my country had done? So I'd like, at this point, to turn to reading the story. there we are. This is what's there?
Yes.
Okay. There we are walking across the dike from the road into the village. Lang is there, and people from the Committee for the Care and Responsibility and Protection of Children are the ones leading us there. It was Lang who introduced me to sitting with families and listening to their stories. I had first met her on a chilly gray day in a rice farming village in Thanh Hoa province, 100 miles or so south of Hanoi. The harvest was in, the fields lay bare and muddy, and so the farmers had a window of time to turn their attention to other pressing matters. Lang was there working with Save the Children US as the trainer for a Train the Trainers workshop being held to scale up a pilot project that had reduced childhood malnutrition by 40% in the first 6 months after it had been implemented. I was there to write a feature story about the workshop. At that time, 60% of Vietnamese children under the age of 5, 60%, were malnourished, yet another consequence of the war. In the villages where Lang worked, the figure was 68%, and half of those children were in danger of dying. Lang's teams achieved sustainable results by following the principle of positive deviance. First, by identifying and learning from the practices of extremely poor village families whose children were nonetheless well nourished, and then by sharing those practices with other people in their villages. The first year of the program, the villagers were able to bring 1,000 children out of malnutrition. And this method, which was at first viewed skeptically by authorities, was being scaled up nationwide. Warm, empathetic, positive, indefatigable, and utterly dedicated, Lang led the participants through carefully structured presentations, realistic role-playing, and vigorous group chants that helped them commit the basic principles of the work to memory. After dinner in the bunkhouse, trainees eager to bring better health to the children of their own villages, plied her with questions until the lights were out. Some years later, I ran into Lang again by chance at a meeting in Hanoi. When I told her I was thinking about recording the stories of people affected by Agent Orange, she was enthusiastically supportive and urged me to visit Tai Binh province, where she had grown up and where she had met many people with stories to tell. Tai Binh is a rice-growing area that lies in the fertile delta at the mouth of the Red River, a 3.5-hour drive southeast of Hanoi. While I was still mulling over whether it would be right to disturb people with my questions, Lang quickly made arrangements. Because she was well respected by the staff of the Committee for Care and Protection of Children in Tai Binh, she was able to arrange for us to spend 3 days there, talking with 8 families in as many villages. What follows is the story of meeting one family. From the committee office in the provincial capital, we drive deep into the delta, through rice fields that stretch green as far as the eye can see, into the cold, gray winter drizzle. At a small town, we turn off the paved road and follow a dirt lane to where it dead ends at a dike. From there, we walk a kilometer or so across the top of the dike, along a narrow path bordered on both sides by rows of lettuce and aromatic herbs. Tall trees protect the greens from the withering sun of other days. Ducks swim in the water, channeled at the base of the dike. Chicken cages dot its banks. When we arrive at Mrs. Ha's home, there. She is cooking lunch over an open fire in the detached kitchen.
Thank you.
They had expected us earlier, but we were late, and because there was no way to telephone to or from the village, the family had gone back to work, thinking our plans had changed. Mrs. Ha's husband, Mr. Bing, had gone to the communal warehouse to get rice wine to sell in the village, and Mrs. Ha had turned to preparing the family meal. She asks us to wait for her husband's return to begin the interview. As we linger for a moment in the courtyard, family and neighbors begin to gather. An old man, giving me a sideways glance, tests my Vietnamese, gesturing with his chin. What is this in Vietnamese? De la Kaisi. Moi nha, I answer. A house. He nods vigorously, then walks up the step into the new brick house. It turns out house is a significant word, symbolizing the care given by the extended family. Mrs. Ha's older brother, a stocky man in a red shirt, khakis, high rubber boots, and sometimes a pith helmet, points to a mud-walled, thatch-roofed house on a low-lying piece of land across the way. You see, that house over there was their house, he tells us. The relatives got together to loan them money to buy this house. It is a loan the relatives know cannot be repaid. My sister and her husband are far too miserable, the brother continues. I mean, in a year, in roughly 12 months, they had to go to the hospital 30 times, and each time there is only us to count on. I think of what it would take to get a sick person to the hospital from there. Down the village lanes to the dike, across the dike to the small country road, through neighboring villages to the main provincial road, and then an hour or so by car to the provincial capital where the hospital was located. But they would not go by car. Would they go by motorbike? I have only seen bicycles in the village. Who would care for the children left behind? Who would look after the house and tend the crops? We go into the house and sit around a low table on small red plastic chairs. Mrs. Ha's brother pours us small cups of tea. While we are waiting, Mrs. Ha tells us about her husband's many illnesses, recalling, "There was a time when the doctors at the hospital in town said, 'That's all we can do. Let him go home and wait for death. If he craves anything, let him have it.' His stomach was swollen, his skin was completely swollen, and he couldn't go to the bathroom. Neighbors, and then other women, and then organizations gave a bit of rice, a few potatoes, and some kernels of corn. And then I had to beg for each small contribution," she says. "And then I had a dream about going into the forest to get medicine for my husband. So I dove through the mud to get to the forest, all the way to Sapa, which is up near the Chinese border. And there was the medicine to give my husband, folk medicine. And he took it and got better and did not die." Long turns the conversation to strains these illnesses have put on their marriage. "Do you ever get angry or think of leaving?" she asks. Mrs. Ha replies, "Sometimes I refrain from speaking, and sometimes I argue a sentence or two. Then I reflect and pity him and cry, not knowing what to do. He is so thin. His skin is so dark. He is now reaching the time of old age and weakness. His life is like the wind." turns to speak to the neighbors and friends who, some in shirt sleeves, some bundled in colorful sweaters and scarves, crowd the plank bed and the little stools, or stand gently joggling their toddlers up and down as they listen to our conversation. When you are happy, she asks them, do you think you can stay that way forever? We can't be miserable forever, uncles and aunts, grandfathers, can we? That's right. That's how I encourage my husband. Get a drink of water. Sorry. Mr. Bing comes in, a slight, serious man wearing a bright blue woolen vest over long-sleeved shirt and faded blue cotton pants. On his feet, a pair of plastic sandals. He tells us that in 1972, before the Paris agreements, he was a special forces soldier in reconnaissance in Taining, a heavily sprayed region in the south. Where he was stationed, the trees were denuded of leaves. He lived in tunnels, bareheaded, barefooted, bare-chested. Another man interjects, camouflaged by spreading mud on his body. Maybe you don't know, but dioxin accumulates in mud as you spread it on the body. It's not a great place to be. We saw 200-liter barrels with yellow stripes, Mr. Bing tells us. They had 3 yellow stripes. We had only been through high school, so we could only read the word zeocene or diocene or something like that. Although rusting barrels of discarded chemicals are still being unearthed and soil permeated with chemicals still causes deaths, this is likely a misreading of the past based on present concerns. Could the words have been do not, or perhaps danger? Mr. Bing continues. At the time, we thought whoever died, died at once, and whoever lived, lived whole. He came home with many of the diseases now recognized as possible effects of exposure to dioxin, to this specific kind of dioxin, CCDD dioxin. Diseases of the skin, of the nervous system, of the circulatory system, of the digestive system. The very regrettable after effects of that war you see in the first fetus my wife gave birth to, he tells us, turning to his wife. My wife, right here. It was like a monster in a fairy tale. You know, it didn't have a human shape, and a few minutes after it was born, it died. His lips draw tight, his eyes narrow, remembering. Very, very hard, he says. And my very own wife has many illnesses, most of them women's illnesses. Women also bear the consequences of this war. The couple's second child is mentally slow. He doesn't know anything, they explain, and just turns from side to side. Their third child is a pretty teenager, she's in the picture here, who sits close to her mother's side as we talk, her long black hair draping over a graceful white blouse. She was born epileptic and blind, with no pupils. Their fourth child was 16 at the time of the interview and enrolled in school. After her daughter was born, Mrs. Haas said to herself, enough. She explains that she didn't know whether the problem births were because of the war or because of fate, but she went to be sterilized. The procedure, which involved inserting medicine into her fallopian tubes, led to many complications, much loss of blood, and repeated operations. As we spoke, she was in pain, with one side of her stomach swollen. This all started from giving birth to children like this, Mrs. Ha explains, and voluntarily going to be sterilized. Then I was unlucky, and the consequence of sterilization was much illness. That made us spend a lot of money that a poor family doesn't have. A very hard situation, very desperate. But it's all for my husband, she continues, all for my children. So I try to overcome the difficulties. Mrs. Ha's brother says he wants to ask me just one more question. In your country, he begins, are there children like this? He gestures around the room. I do not understand his implication and cannot answer. Children this strong, this tall, this big, or smaller. One of the women sitting on the bed puts her hand over her mouth, laughs, and exclaims, "Oh, I've seen on TV. They are big. Vietnamese are the smallest." Mrs. Ha's brother continues, "Our life here should be like that of our international friends. But because the war lasted far too long, all our lives, we lost the chance to study because at 18 we left school and took up the gun. When the enemy was gone, we came back to feed our children. But there was not enough, so they are sickly and puny like this, you see? These are the consequences of war," Mr. Bing explains. What he is saying is that the consequences of war are very great. Earlier, Mrs. Ha has thanked me and the American government for paying attention to them and trying to help. When Mr. Bing again thanks me as a representative of the American government, I explain that I do not represent the government, that I do not know if the government will help, but that I believe ordinary people will. Because everything comes from the people, doesn't it? Mrs. Ha's brother observes. When he sees I am again not fully following his meaning, he explains, because if the people have sincere hearts and make demands on their government, most governments must execute those policies, because the government is for the people, isn't it? At the time, his remark puzzled me, as it seemed to come straight out of an American high school civics book. Later, I learned that shortly before our visit, farmers in Taiping had rounded up corrupt local government officials and kept them under house arrest until the central government replaced them. Mr. Bing makes this request. I want to ask you to say this to the American people. An unavoidable war broke out between our two countries. In reality, nobody wanted it. Now, both sides understand each other and the two countries are friends and trade business. He quotes a saying you often hear, close the past and open the future. The two countries circulate goods. They've exchanged ambassadors already. But what happened before, that is, the consequences of the bombs and bullets and of the chemicals, outrages the Vietnamese people. Yes, because the result is not to kill a person at once, but the result waits for the children and for the grandchildren. So I really hope the American people, together with the Vietnamese people, will demand that the American government not produce those chemicals any longer. Don't take them to make war with any other country. What is banned by international law should not be used. So stop using them. Yes, not just I myself in particular, or just the Vietnamese people in particular, but the whole world in general opposes these chemicals. After his words, we fall silent. And then it is time to pack up and go. Mr. Bing thanks me for trying to bring help. I respond that it is rather late. Yes, he agrees. If help had come earlier, his suffering would have been less. But I am still here, he adds, and my wife is still here. Other people told other stories. There are thousands of these stories, each one different, each a part of a mosaic, each telling, adding to the story. I want to close with a quote from another woman, Mrs. Holm. A woman, afterwards, there are pictures here of the 4 provinces in the book. You're welcome to come up and thumb through. There's also a mask. There are also pieces of quilt that this woman, Mrs. Holm, made. This woman who had one hand shot off by the Americans, who was in the forest heavily doused with chemicals. A few years after this conversation, she died of one of those cancers. But I'd like you to listen to her spirit in this quote. Yes, and there she is with her quilt. You must tell it, must put it into the pages of history. It must get into the pages of the history of our country, our generation, of the world. Remember, there is a woman like this, with all these stories, all this suffering, and one hand locked off in the war. But remember, too, that she loves people, she loves her country, and she loves life. So a mix. That's so I welcome questions, observations, your own experiences.
I have a question as to the kind of aid that is now available, because I mean this is still extant. Does the Vietnamese government provide aid? Does the American government continue to provide aid? Do the non-NGOs continue? What is the status of
It's, I'm not the best person to answer this. I can give you a taste of it.
Yeah.
At this point, there's $500 million that the U.S. Congress has allocated. The large bulk of that is to trying to get rid of the remaining dioxin in the ground at the Air Force bases. But USAID has done a survey of 6, I think 6, it keeps changing, provinces and of the needs of people in those provinces, and is starting to give some support. I don't know what you can call it, really. You can't cure it, you can't, but you can ease the suffering somewhat.
What progress have they made in getting rid of the dioxin? I mean, where are we at now?
Yeah, in most places in Vietnam,
Yeah.
you know, if it's just one spraying, it dissolves fairly rapidly into all the rain and all the sunshine. It dissolves. It can get pushed down into the mud, as I said, and then get into the fish and get into the duck and bioaccumulate up the food chain. They have cleared Da Nang, the Da Nang, the air base there. They are working on Bien Hoa, which is outside of Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. That's supposed to take 10 years, and it started maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, and they've cleared a couple of other bases. The Vietnamese government has cleared another couple of bases, but the ones I'm talking about were cooperation between American military and Vietnamese military.
Clearing means they take the mud and they put it somewhere else? What does clearing mean?
There are various methods that are being, last I knew, were being debated. Sometimes you cement it over so nobody touches it, so kids don't go
Right,
and
right.
play in the mud and whatnot. Sometimes you bake it, and that can destroy the toxin. You know, different methods.
I have another question. So are the families getting direct, like, financial aid or food aid, or
Yes.
what's aid look like?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it ongoing, or is it just like, here's your aid and bye-bye? Or is it like an ongoing process?
Again, the last I knew, it's the government, the Vietnamese government, gives a monthly subsidy
Oh, okay.
of $10, something like that, enough to be meaningful in Vietnam, but not transformative.
Diane, you went to Vietnam a mere, was it 16 years after the war was officially over? And then you spent a good 10 years there. The change in the country, or even the people during that time that you were there, as we look back, it's been about 49 years since fighting stopped. I was just curious about what you saw between 1991 and the 10th year you were there in 2001.
It's a good question. Let me answer more easily. Now, I was just told a week or so ago that maybe 5% of the people in Vietnam these days have any direct experience of the war.
That's right.
So there's quite we're left with, and that was something, when I first went there, I said I would never speak about the war because Vietnam was so vital and alive and poor, but vital and alive, and had such a rich cultural history, and that Americans, when you think of at that time, when they thought of Vietnam, it was part of a two-word phrase, Vietnam and war. That was not what I wanted to see. I'm not answering your question.
No, I think.
The 10 years, when I first went, this is something of an answer, but it's not a political answer. When I first went there, it was a compliment to say to somebody, "Oh, you're looking fat." And by the time, actually by the second or third year I was there were programs on television warning about obesity. So they're the unexploded ordnance, there's Agent Orange, they're all the remnants of the war. One remnant of the war is not enough food, and reclaiming the land to create enough food. And so as that went on, there were happiness indexes, and Vietnam, I may be misremembering this, but I was going to say always ranked happier than the United States, but it definitely always ranked happy, as you're living in a place where you see things getting better, so visibly better, physically better. That's part of the answer to that question.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions before we sign some books?
All right.
We have-
Oh, sorry.
Diane, can you help us get a sense of what can we do as a people to help undo what our country has done? Are there some small ways or steps we can take to
Yeah.
do something, to help the people?
Yeah, there's several small ways, and you are with Beatitudes, and Beatitudes annually raises funds to support a doctor in Hue who's working with particularly hard, impoverished areas. So that's one way. There's a group called War Legacies Project, which you can Google, and they have a number of different projects going on. This is on a large scale. There was an American veteran who was dying of Agent Orange related diseases, and he was a lawyer before this and had enough money, and he said, take my compensation money and give it to families in Vietnam. And so there's a whole network set up for him. But small things, as I say, $10 a month is quite useful. So, yeah. And I think I brought. Well, I don't see it, but at the back of the book, they're listed some of the places that you can help. This is another book. I'm selling other books, but The Long Reckoning. I would have chosen Reckoning as the title of my book, but I learned as I was suggesting it that it had already been taken. But this is a great book, I think. It's The Long Reckoning, the story of war, peace, and redemption in Vietnam by George Black. You may have seen him in the New York Times. He follows the lives of a few veterans, and one veteran who's dear to my heart, who went back in '93 and has lived there ever since, working to demine or to get the UXOs out of Vietnam. Something like 100,000 people have been killed after the end of the war through the UXOs. It's an ongoing problem, less than it was, but still there.
Diane Fox, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone living with Asian